What are the commonalities among leaders who sustain excellence over an extended period of time? All right, Ozan Varol, welcome. It's so great to have you here on the Learning Leader Show.
Thank you so much, Ryan, for having me on. Delighted to be here.
So you were recommended to me by our mutual friend, Shane Snow. I remember the email said, I have a dope podcast guest. And Shane almost never does this, by the way. So he only does it when he knows I'm going to like it because he knows I'm very picky. And at that point, I said, it doesn't even matter who he says. I'm saying yes. However, I pick up your book, Ozan, called Think Like a Rocket Scientist. And I can't stop talking about the stories within it with my wife and my friends. So huge credit to you, man, for putting out a fantastic piece of work that is creating a lot of dialogue with a lot of people.
Thank you so much, Ryan. I mean, coming from you, that means a lot. And that's really what you just said is like the most wonderful thing an author can hear. So thank you so much. That means a lot.
I certainly, it's well deserved. I know how hard it is, and especially the way that you weave the stories and the science and application together. It's an incredible skill, and you make it look easy. But I'm curious, Ozan, to get us started. You know, I love studying people who have sustained excellence, and you certainly are one of those yourself in your own right. So we could just deconstruct your own process, and we will for part of this time, but you've also spent time around others who have, whether it's in academia and sending something to Mars and much more beyond that. But I'm curious from your perspective, what have you found to be some of the commonalities among people who have sustained excellence?
The first thing that popped to mind, Ryan, when you asked that question is the ability to learn from failure. And I'd love to dig a little deeper into that. So, we went from, I think, being really afraid of failure. Now the pendulum has swung in this other direction in Silicon Valley, where we've sort of become obsessed with it almost, right? Celebrating and fetishizing failure, I think, to a dangerous degree. So you have the mantra of fail fast, fail often, fail forward. There are now conferences dedicated to celebrating failure. Silicon Valley companies are holding funerals for failed startups, complete with like bagpipes and DJ spinning records and sponsorships by liquor companies. And I don't buy it. Like, based on my study of excellence, of sustained excellence across numerous industries, there are two problems that are wrong with that approach. One is, regardless of what Silicon Valley tells you, failure sucks. Whoever says they celebrate failure and they don't mind failing is lying to you. But more importantly, when we celebrate something, we don't learn from it. So the mantra should really be learn fast and not fail fast. Because fail fast, research shows, doesn't lead to sustained excellence, doesn't lead to sustained success. What most people do is they move from one failure to the next, repeating the same mistakes, making the same bad decisions, taking the same bad risks, and not getting better with each iteration. Whereas the successful people do the opposite. They learn from each iteration and they get better with each one. Breakthroughs, whether it's in science or in business, tend to be evolutionary, not revolutionary. So if you're trying to achieve something transformative, you're not going to succeed on the first try. Einstein's first several proofs for E equals mc squared failed. SpaceX's first 3 launches were spectacular disasters. They were failures. But each of them learned. So Einstein learned from his failures, SpaceX learned from their failures, and in the end produced these groundbreaking products. And in Einstein's case, it was this groundbreaking theory. In SpaceX's case, it's this aerospace company that's disrupting this deeply established industry. We have an obsession with grand openings and trying to get things right from the get-go, but the opening doesn't have to be grand as long as the finale is. And the best way to make the finale grand is to learn from your failures.
You have a chapter in your book at the end, and I took a lot of notes on, because this is one of the areas I read again today. I was on getting ready, called "Nothing Fails Like Success," and in it, you talk about the Challenger disaster, as well as the Columbia spacecraft that disintegrated upon reentry in 2003. So there was a disaster in 1986, which I, I mean, I pay attention to space. I wanted to be an astronaut when I was a kid, so like I'm really into this stuff. But I for some reason I didn't think about the Columbia disintegrating upon reentry in 2003, because maybe it was the footage of it isn't the same as the Challenger. Um, and I found that fascinating, about the fact that take the inverse of failure, look at success, but sometimes success can create failure. Could you describe, maybe help illustrate those stories, and then apply that to how we think about that today?
Absolutely. So Challenger and Columbia, the technical flaws were very different. And I'll just briefly mention what the technical flaws were. In Challenger, it was a failure of what's called the O-rings. These are flexible rubber bands that seal the solid rocket boosters and prevent hot gases from leaking out of them. And NASA had been flying space shuttles with damaged O-rings for several years before the Challenger disaster. And a number of engineers raised their hands and said, hey, this is really dangerous. An engineer by the name of Roger Bourgelat, 6 months before Challenger, he wrote a memo saying that the repeated failure of the O-rings could cause a catastrophe of the highest order, the loss of human life. But his memo was ignored primarily because and I should also mention, like, these were really difficult decisions, and there's definitely hindsight bias here. We may have made the same decision to launch Challenger if you and I were sitting there on that morning, but that doesn't mean we can't learn from them. And so one of the takeaways here, and one of the reasons why the most capable managers at NASA developed tunnel vision, is because of the string of successes they had leading up to the Challenger mission. And the idea was like, if we just do what we did with the previous launches, nothing bad can happen. And that completely discounts the role that luck plays in the process, right? Because it's possible to do things wrong and still succeed because luck intervenes to save the day. And that's basically what was happening. The primary O-ring was failing in these missions, and the secondary O-ring was kicking in to save the day, but the temperatures on the morning of Challenger's launch were really cold, which made the O-rings brittle and incapable of performing their function. And then fast forward 17 years, you get to Columbia. Now, I mean, it looks like, if you're just looking at it on the surface, the failure is very different. Now, Columbia explodes on re-entry because of what NASA had called foam shedding. During liftoff, a foam had separated and struck the space shuttle's thermal insulation, which is responsible for protecting the shuttle from the searing heat of re-entry. That was the technical flaw. But the cultural flaw was the same as Challenger. It was assuming, basically, that because foam shedding had been happening on numerous space shuttle missions before Columbia, and those missions were all characterized as successes because nothing bad, the outcome of the mission hadn't been compromised. And though that string of successes basically led managers at NASA to develop tunnel vision, but just because you're on a hot streak doesn't mean you'll beat the house. And when we're busy, popping champagne corks and lighting cigars to celebrate our successes, we fail to realize that we succeeded despite making a bad decision, right? Despite a bad misstep. Which, going back to what I was mentioning before about learning from failures, I think the same idea applies to learning from success as well. So just so we don't learn from failure, we also don't learn from success, because we're too busy celebrating our successes as opposed to doing an investigation of like what went wrong and what went right. And so if you're, go ahead, Ryan.
So I think of Ozan, one of the things I like to do when I work with leaders and teams, and I'll say, so how did last year go? And then I work a lot of sales leaders, so like VPs, SVPs of companies, and I'll say, so how did last year go? Very just open-ended. You can say whatever. And it's nice when they say, well, last year was great. We beat expectations. We were 103% of budget, things like that. And my obvious immediate next question is, why? What was it that made last year great? That made last year, why did you succeed? Because that was the definition of success within your company, was exceeding the budget that was set for you by the company. And that's always the most interesting part during the work goes on, because you can tell if someone has done a good, and you use the phrase post-mortem, and we can talk about what that means.
Right.
I like also a military phrase like an after-action review is another good one that to use. You can tell the people who have done a quality after-action review from that great year versus the ones who are like, well, because we're just talented. We have great people. We have, and to those who say that, they may have great people. That may be true. But I am very weary, scared for them, for their sake, that they'll be able to continue to have success, because I believe not only should you have a deep understanding of why you failed, you need to have a deep understanding of why you've succeeded, of why you've hit it. Because like you said, there is luck. There are other circumstances. At a minimum, you need to be knowledgeable of that. And so can you relate this? And I just kind of did, but I want it from your perspective, from the rocket scientist perspective. Can you relate for that mid-level manager who's working, maybe some practical application for them so that they don't run into some of the same issues that happened to some of the smartest people in the world at NASA and had loss of life?
Okay. Yeah. And I love that phrase, Ryan, which I hadn't heard before, after action review. I call it a postmortem. And I call it a postmortem because that's what a lot of business leaders use. And I actually don't like the term. And I don't like the term because postmortem implies that there has to be a dead body.
Right. And it's a
catastrophic
Latin phrase,
failure.
Right? Didn't you say it's after death is a Latin
phrase?
Yeah,
after death. Exactly. Yeah. That's exactly what it means. It was taken from medicine. From autopsies, and then implanted into the business context. After action review is a much better way of putting it, because you're just reviewing the action, right, regardless of whether it produced a success or failure, which is, I think, a much more healthy way of thinking about it. And also it implies that you should be doing this review regardless of what happens, regardless of success or failure. So I'm going to mention two things in response to your question. So one is taking the focus off of outcomes of success versus failure, that binary approach, and actually looking at the inputs. Did we make the right decisions? Did we hire quality people? Did those people do what they were supposed to do? Because here's the thing, it's possible to do a lot wrong and still succeed because luck intervenes. So just like some of the managers that you mentioned, we had a great year. Well, you had a great year not because you made the right decisions, but you might have had a great year because you got lucky, right? The economy was doing well. And so all of these factors that are external to your own decision-making process may have intervened to save the day. So that's part of it. And then the same idea applies to failure too as well, by the way. A lot of business leaders will try to change everything when a failure happens. And that's not necessarily the right course of action, because sometimes good decisions lead to failure. Because, whenever you're experimenting with something new, whenever you're taking a leap into the unknown, you're exploring edges or building things that may not work, failure is going to happen. But that doesn't mean that all of your decisions were incorrect. You shouldn't scrap all of them and start over from scratch. I cite a study in the book about how NFL coaches tend to completely change their lineup after a 1-point loss, but they don't do it after a 1-point gain. They assume that because the match produced a failure that they have to shake everything up, even though on a different day it actually may have produced a win. So that's part of it. And then the other part of it is doing something called a pre-mortem, which is the opposite of a post-mortem or after-action review, where you take a look at what happened after success or after failure. Pre-mortem happens before. You basically assume, the way this works is suppose you've got a launch coming up in 6 months, right? You're launching a new product. And you gather all the relevant people in a room and you tell them that we're going to assume that the product failed. and I want you to come up with reasons why. So, and then everybody brainstorms and comes up with a list of reasons as to what can go wrong. That exercise can be really powerful because it provides safety to people to express dissent. No one likes to be the skunk in the picnic, the person pounding their fists on the table saying that, hey, this might go wrong and here's why. But if you tell people that we're going to conduct this exercise specifically to identify the weaknesses, the points of potential failure, then it empowers people to step forward and share things that they otherwise may not be willing to share because of, we all want to fit in and conform. And so that exercise is really powerful. Another one which is related to that, which I've seen used with great success, which also has a military equivalent, is called the kill the company exercise. And the military might call that red teaming. And so you assign executives to play the role of a competitor, and in business this would be a competitor business, and you play the role of a competitor and basically figure out ways to put your own business out of business. You come up with strategies to put it, and I've seen this described in Lisa Bodell's book called Kill the Company. And that also is a really powerful way of identifying potential points of failure, because you're basically asking people to completely switch perspectives and not just think outside the box, but actually step outside the box and look at the box from the perspective of a competitor looking to destroy the box. And that forces people to use new neural pathways and adopt new perspectives that they otherwise might miss if you simply ask them, where are the potential points of failure, or where are the weaknesses in our company?
I've recently been reading a book about the creation and since growth of Instagram. The title's actually blanking right now, but regardless of that, it sold for $1 billion to Facebook with 13 employees and no revenue. But one of the reasons why is because it feels like Mark Zuckerberg, and there are a lot of opinions out there about him, understandably, but one of his obsessions is not becoming MySpace. Everyone has said he is obsessed with that. And he thought things like WhatsApp or Instagram, and there are plenty of others, could make him and his company MySpace. And so it feels to me like he is regularly, and I believe that one of the people that you cite who started that exercise was Merck's CEO.
Yeah, that's right, Kenneth Frazier. Yeah,
Kenneth Frazier was one of the first people to do that exercise, and I've heard of that, and I think it could be very useful. What about for that person, Ozan, who, let's say they're not the CEO or even a senior exec in a company, but they're running a team of 15 people in the middle of a company? Is there a way that they could do that sort of kill the company exercise to be useful to create innovative thoughts within their team?
Absolutely. So this doesn't have to be kill the company. It could be kill the project or kill the product, right? Whatever product your team is working on, whatever project. It can be, I've done this with my books, writing a book, what can go wrong? And so it can really be applied to anything on a much smaller scale. And as you are going through this exercise, I would highly encourage you to really put yourself in the position of a competitor or in the position of a customer as well, which is also really powerful, because we often look at our projects and our products from our own perspective, and we miss the human dimension to our products. So it's important to ask, why are customers, and so this is a variation of the kill the company exercise, but why are customers justified in buying from our competitors? And the answer, by the way, isn't that they're stupid. It's not because they're wrong and you're right. It's because they see something you're not seeing. They believe something that you don't believe. They're telling themselves a different story. And you're not going to be able to identify that story and even begin to change it if you're looking at the world through your own limited perspective.
Interesting. It also makes me think of, from a preparation perspective, I recently spoke with Admiral William McRaven, and he said you have to rehearse the risk out of your mission.
Hmm.
And so like he was in charge of the bin Laden raid in Pakistan, and he said the amount of times they practiced, I mean, over for months, they practiced the raid for months to rehearse the risk as much as possible out of the mission. I think that's another. It's kind of a sidecar view, but that's another perspective here. Ozan, one of the other parts about you that I think is fascinating was I was when I was reading about your upbringing, and I'm really curious about people who go on to be productive achievers like yourself, and what they were like when they were a kid, and their parents and their upbringing. And you grew up in a school system, and I want you to share what that's like and where it was, that forced conformity, and even something I believe you wrote about was that cutting your hair um, could create some sort of punishment if it actually not cutting your hair if it got too
Right.
long.
Yep.
And so, what was it like growing up in that setting? And then actually until you eventually got out of it, how did that change your perspective on the world?
Yeah, so I grew up in Istanbul, Turkey, and I grew up in a family of no English speakers. My parents had never been to the United States before, and in primary school, as you said, Ryan, it was a very conformist system, and I'll just mention two examples of how deep the conformity ran. In first grade, we were all assigned numbers, and one of our teachers would call us by those numbers instead of our real name. So I wouldn't be called Ozan. I would be called 138. And I won't reveal my actual number
Because it's your PIN number, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's the only PIN number I've ever had.
I saw you put that in your book. I was like, hey, there might be people who are reading this that remember your number from school. But anyway, go ahead.
So that was part of it, and then like as you mentioned, Ryan, it was we all wore the same uniforms. We all had to have the same buzz cut, and I once made the grave error of skipping a haircut, and my school principal, who was a bulldozer of a man, better suited to be a prison warden than a school principal, he would conduct these inspections, and he noticed my longer than standard hairdo, and he grabbed a hair clip from one of the girls in my class and put it on my hair as an act of public shaming, of the price you pay for not towing the line, for not conforming, for not using number two pencils, for not coloring between the lines. And that was really, so I sort of became this like non-conformist, slightly as a rebellion against that very conformist culture. But also outside of school, I cultivated this interest in astronomy. I would read science fiction books as an escape, basically, and to pull myself into different worlds where imagination and creativity was rewarded. And my parents did their very best to foster that. One of the most formative moments in my personal life, I remember, I think I must have been like 4 or 5 years old and about to start kindergarten. And the way that the system worked in Istanbul is there was like, 5 or 6 public kindergartens close to your house, and you could have your pick. And my parents visited all 6, and they vetted them basically and filtered them down to 3. They were all of those 3 were okay, acceptable from their perspective. And they came home and they told me, Ozan, you're going to start kindergarten, and you get to choose which school you're going to attend. And they took me to all 3 schools, and they said you have to, think through questions that you want to ask them, or the things that you find important. And like, the 4-year-old me or the 5-year-old me is like, what kind of toys do you have? Or like, what kind of books do you have? But it made me feel so empowered in a way that the school system didn't. It made me feel like my destiny was in my own hands, that when it came to the important decisions in my life, I had a say. And that anything was possible too. I mean, my parents both came from very, very humble economic circumstances. But they made me believe that if you want something, you can go and get it. And that stayed with me throughout my whole life.
And you eventually came to the States to go to Cornell. What made you choose to come to the United States and go to Cornell?
2 things. One was trying to get out of this conformist education system.
Real quick,
Yeah.
why is it set up that way? Is that just the way it? I mean, that may be a really dumb question, but why is
No,
it?
no, no. It's a
Yeah,
great question, by the way. And
yeah,
like, and I think education systems, by and large, are conformist. It's just different degrees of
right.
conformity, and it's in part because public education, and this is true in the United States as well, was developed in the industrial age to create factory workers. Right? You had to conform and do as your boss told you to be able to operate the assembly line in a factory somewhere. They weren't built to produce people who reimagine the status quo or who challenge conventional wisdom. That sort of behavior, I think, is rarely awarded, regardless of what education system you're in. It was just, I think that conformity and the subjugation of the individual to the greater good of the community is just more deeply ingrained into the Turkish culture. And by the way, I mean, I love the country of Turkey. My parents still live there. It was just the conformity aspect of it really was a complete, it was a disconnect between the way that I was and I was raised. And so that's one of the reasons why I came to the United States and I
Were
picked
you
Cornell.
real quick?
Yeah.
Were you an outcast? Were you an outlier in Turkey? Did you have? Could you relate to others, or I'm just curious, or did you find it a whole gang of nonconformists who wanted to come to the States or go somewhere else? Or I'm just curious about that part of like socially how it was.
Yeah, no, I think I had a few people in class who were like me, but by and large, I was on my own. I
Gotcha.
spent most of my time in my room reading books. I taught myself how to program on my computer. I learned HTML programming. I would build websites um, and which all of which like I had no idea at the time what would become actually really important when I came to Cornell and applied to work on this Mars mission. And one of the reasons why I was hired was because the principal investigator of the mission thought that the coding skills that I had picked up would be really valuable, and they turned out to be the case. So I came to Cornell to study astrophysics in part to just get out of that conformist education system, but also Cornell had a reputation for being really good in astronomy. And one of my heroes growing up was Carl Sagan. And Carl Sagan, I would watch the Cosmos series, the original Cosmos series, on old Betamax tapes. I didn't speak English when I was watching them, so I had no idea what Sagan was talking about, but I still sit there and watch them. And
You didn't
and
speak.
the
When did you learn to speak English?
I started learning it when I was in middle school. So I
Wow,
was
you
11 or
have
12. Yeah.
hardly an accent. Okay, anyway, that's wild. Okay, go ahead.
And so I came to Cornell and with a very thick accent, by the way, and then it just sort of disappeared. I remember my sophomore year, my college roommate was like, "Dude, there's something happening to your accent." And then I picked up a Philly accent because he's from Philly. So I came to Cornell and before I arrived, I was doing some research online about what the astronomy department was up to, and I found out that one of the professors was the principal investigator for this planned mission to Mars, and to top it off, he had worked as a graduate student under Carl Sagan. It was like too good to be true, and there was no job listing, but one of the best pieces of advice I got from my father is you can't win the lottery without buying a ticket. And so I sent him an email expressing my burning desire to work for him and listing all of the limited set of qualifications I had built up in high school. And much to my surprise and delight, he ended up hiring me. And so I ended up working on the operations team for what would become the 2003 Mars Exploration Rovers mission. I did that for 4 years.
Wow. I want to highlight that piece of advice. That was a big highlight in your book that I marked, and it not necessarily the thought of everyone buys lottery tickets, but it's the mindset that I guess I could rephrase it by saying if you don't have the guts to ask or the willingness to be proactive, the answer is always no. We talked about our mutual friend Shane Snow, and part of the way I got him on my podcast before I even had a podcast, essentially, was just the willingness to continue to email and find that email and ask and ask and ask, and eventually he said yes. And I think that's kind of how this whole thing has grown. And so maybe could you share your mindset, because as a young kid, an immigrant, to have even the gumption to apply for a job that didn't exist, how can others maybe, what could they learn from that story and implement into their lives so that they can maybe eliminate some of the fear of being willing to go and ask for something that they really want?
That's a great question, and I think you pinpointed the problem really well. The being afraid of a no, being afraid of rejection, it really comes down to a failure of courage, and the difference between the people we put on a pedestal, right? The universe enters, the world changers. The difference between them and then the rest of the world is that they're willing to take action when the rest of the world is standing still. That's the primary difference. So then how do you cultivate that mindset? One of the things I did when I was, I drafted this email to Steve, who would become my boss, Steve Squires, and as I was about to send it, that voice started talking in my head, right? That the voice of the inner critic, like, who are you? You're this skinny kid with a funny name from a country halfway around the globe. What value do you have? Like, what are you able to contribute? He's probably going to, pull up your email and laugh and move on with his day. And that voice, by the way, still exists, right? It'll still come roaring in unexpectedly whenever I'm about to make a leap into something new. So then I ask myself two questions. The first is, what's the worst that can happen? And it's really important to write this down, write the answers down, because there's something about the act of writing your fears down that disempowers them, that takes their power away. If you just let them sort of linger in your mind, they keep getting powerful and powerful. The act of writing really takes their power away. And so in the case of this email I was thinking about sending, what's the worst that can happen is he'll laugh, he'll move on with his day, and he just won't reply to me. That is the worst that can happen. And then the second question I ask is, what's the best that can happen? And that is a really important question, and one that most of us don't ask is, whenever we're faced with uncertainty of taking a leap into the unknown, we tend to focus on all of the negative outcomes, because uncertainty to our ancestors could be life-threatening. It's not anymore in most cases. It's really important to ask, what is the best that can happen? And to me, the best that can happen was that I would get this job working on a Mars mission, which was my childhood dream, and it would come true, and it did. And so if you put it that way, like, the choice of sending the email becomes so obvious, but unless you ask those two questions, you find yourself just not acting. And I love that Chinese proverb which says, many a false step was made by standing still. So that's important to keep in mind as well.
Wait, say that again?
Many a false step was made by standing still.
Explain that.
As in, standing still could be a false step, right? And so we tend to think
you say
that...
false?
False, yeah.
Okay, I thought you said full. Yeah. I'm sorry.
No, I'm sorry about that. Yeah, false step. Yeah.
False step. Okay.
Yep,
okay.
Exactly. So not taking action can be riskier than taking action.
And maybe even a follow-up to that, because I have to, like, I'm sure you do this too. At times you have an idea, and so for me, a lot of my work is done in public. A lot of my work is done with people who want to sign up for something I'm going to do. And, a lot of things have worked that have been pretty cool, but I've also publicly put out things to say, hey, I'm going to do this kind of course, or I'm going to teach this live, or I'm going to do something, and then it doesn't work, Yeah. And it's like, I think eliminating or at least squashing the fear of being embarrassed publicly, that's another part of that, not being afraid to, you just be like, hey, yeah, I'm kind of embarrassed, but we got to move forward. I mean, right. What else am I going to do? Just not try things? I mean, I have ideas, and some of the ideas are really stupid, and that's just part of how it works. I think all of us should just be a little bit more okay with having stupid ideas, even when other people see them publicly, and you're like, I mean, what's the worst? Like you said, what's the worst that could happen? I'm temporarily embarrassed, and then you move on.
Right, exactly. And I think it's also helpful to adopt that like experimental mindset, which is what
Yeah.
a lot of scientists do, right? You approach life as a series of experiments. You're going to try launching something new, and you know at the outset, like, this may not work,
Hmm.
but I'm not gonna know if it's going to work until I try it. Like, no amount of sitting on my couch and thinking through it is gonna help. I mean, some of it is helpful, of course, but unless you actually put that idea into the world and make that offer, you're not going to know how the world is going to react. And if you frame what you're doing as an experiment, for me at least, that has a way of taking some of the sting associated with the failure, because then it's just okay, it's just a hypothesis that was proven wrong. I'll learn something from this, and then I'll apply it to something else. You know, if the project didn't work because the product market fit wasn't right, I can pivot to a different market. And that experimental mindset allows for that as well. And then another thing that I found helpful is to put some distance between me as a person and the ideas of me or the
Mm.
products of me, right? Because we tend to tie our identity around what we produce. But if you can put some distance around your projects, yeah, you're creating those projects, but they're not a reflection on you as a person. They're not you. They're your ideas, they're your experiments. You're just trying things out. And if they don't work, that's fine. You're still you. The things that you value the most are still going to be there in most cases, regardless of the outcome of these experiments.
One of my favorite quotes that you've used when it comes to one of your heroes, Carl Sagan, is science is a way of thinking
Mm.
much more than it is a body of knowledge. And that struck a chord with me, and I really appreciate that thought and mindset. Can you share more about your approach to science and that it's a way of thinking more than just a body of knowledge?
Yeah, and the way that science education usually works is that you sit in a classroom and you memorize a bunch of facts, right? You learn about Newton's laws and you learn about the principles of physics. And that honestly drains the life out of a really interesting field, which is one of the reasons why I wanted to write this book. I wanted to write the book not to teach people the science behind rocket science. That's not what the book is about. But the book is about more about what Sagan is talking about, which is how do you take ways of thinking from this very different field and actually apply it in your own life. And that I think is when the intimidation creeps in, when you say, well, rocket scientists, you have to be a genius to think like them, that's completely incorrect. So much of what they talk about can be applied regardless of what business you're in, but because of the way that science is conceptualized, because of the way that our science classes were taught, we assume that science means you're going to sit down and memorize a bunch of stuff that you're going to forget after you take the exam. But it's really much more about how do you approach problems? How do you approach uncertainty? How do you make difficult decisions? How do you deal with failure? And how do you deal with success? And those frameworks are really useful regardless of what you're doing. And I'm really the living embodiment of this, because after college I quit astrophysics and ended up going to law school and becoming a law professor, and now I do popular writing and speaking before corporate audiences, and I've taken those principles from rocket science and apply them to dozens of industries, and they work beautifully. So part of the reason why I wanted to write this book was to remedy that disconnect, to bridge that gap between what rocket scientists know and do and what the rest of the world does.
Ozan, one of the things I found to be really interesting in guests I've had on my show, especially the really smart ones, and you've talked to some of the same people. Tim Urban comes to mind, really, really intelligent writer, funny too.
Yeah.
But when I read this from you, it made me think of people like him. Is that we should be fueled not by a desire for a quick catharsis but by intrigue. Where certainty ends, progress begins. And what I found, and I want to hear you talk about that in a second, but what I found is the people who seem to be the most intelligent thinkers in the world, they're never quite sure about anything. You know what I mean? They're always a little bit like Tim. When I asked him that sustaining excellence question, it took him like a minute to start figuring out an answer. And then he got there and it was really good. But it's because these deep thinkers who are really smart, guys like you and him and Shane and others, it's that you're never certain about anything. Like, you have thoughts, you have opinions, you have, some facts to back it up, obviously, but you always know I'm still experimenting, and that could change. And I think that's the mentality a lot of us need to have, especially now on social media and the things out there where everybody knows all the answers. I'm so unattracted to people who think they have all the answers. I love the ones more like you and those people who think, this is what I believe, but I also think that could change. And I think you're right about flip-flopping and why that could be a positive. I'm curious how that kind of mindset has become part of you, as well as some of the people that you work with.
Yeah, I mean, it's so inherent to the scientific method, right? So you have hypotheses, but the way that you figure out what's right is actually by trying to prove yourself wrong, which is the opposite of what we do. Most of us look for evidence to confirm what we think we know, as opposed to looking for evidence that's going to disprove us. And that's where the uncertainty comes in, right? If you're so certain of your conclusions, you're going to completely ignore any facts to the contrary. And that's going to get in the way of progress. But if your goal is to find what's right, not to be right, then you keep an open mind and you actually actively seek out people. And this has become so hard in the age of social media, where we're algorithmically sorted into these echo chambers, and it becomes so easy to disconnect with people who disagree with us. It requires you to actively step out and ask people, befriend people who disagree with you, or ask people who normally agree with you to disagree with you. And you should do this as a business leader as well. And your employees, the people working for you, are not going to do this unless you affirmatively ask them, in most cases. So one of the things I did, for example, with my book, after I finished the first draft, I gave it to people to read it. But when I gave it to them, I said, tell me what's wrong with this. Tell me what should be changed, what should be taken out. Not what's right, but what's wrong. And I think that allows for psychological safety on the part of the people who might be reluctant, right? Especially if they're working for you, if their next paycheck depends on you, to share negative views or to share critique. That allows them to step forward with that. And related to that is the idea, I'm always, whenever someone calls me an expert, I like look around and see who's standing behind me. And the reason for that is I'm actually really afraid of calling myself an expert or becoming an expert on anything, because the moment we think we're an expert is the moment we begin asserting confident conclusions without backing it up with the facts. The moment we think we've made it is the moment that we stop learning and growing. So I continuously tell myself that I'm a work in progress. Going back to like the Challenger and Columbia accidents too, that we talked about before, one of the reasons during the Apollo, Mercury, and Gemini era, we didn't lose a single crew in space. There was a fire on the ground with Apollo 1, but we did not lose a single crew member in space during the really early, really risky periods of spaceflight. The first time we lost an American crew in space was Challenger. After spaceflight had become quote unquote routine, after this was like viewed as not particularly risky anymore, after we had declared ourselves an expert in what we were doing, is the moment we lost a crew in spaceflight. And I think the same idea applies whether or not you're running a business or you're in academia. It doesn't matter. It's the same principle that once you erase doubt, once you become so confident, you end up missing crucial facts.
Something you've said is, in the modern world, we look for certainty in uncertain places. We search for order and chaos, the right answer and ambiguity, and conviction in the complexity. And I think that applies really well to right now. I like to make these timeless, but I think this could apply to any time where somebody might be dealing with uncertainty. And you've also said that all progress happens in uncertain times, and I that actually, it made me feel good. And I wanted to talk to you about that, about how progress can be made in uncertain times, and how in the world that we live in, we look for certainty even though it's hard. What advice do you have for leaders in this time where there isn't an answer? There is uncertainty for the near future and distant. What do you share and say to them as they're seeking your advice right now?
And one is to reiterate what you just said, Ryan, which is all progress happens in uncertain conditions. If you look at any breakthrough that's ever happened, it happened because of uncertainty. Answers, certainty are really cheap. But we are so driven by fear of uncertainty. I mean, people, and I'm sure you're seeing this around you as well, people actually prefer the certainty of a worst case scenario over the uncertainty of the unknown. Like, I'd rather know tomorrow that this horrible thing is going to happen instead of becoming curious about what tomorrow might bring. So one is the shift from fear of the unknown to becoming curious about tomorrow. And I think that's easier said than done. The way that you become curious about tomorrow is to ask yourself a series of questions. So one is, and this is actually a question I had to ask myself, what problems can I solve right now based on what the world needs, as opposed to the problems that I had expected to solve? If the pandemic has disrupted the way you run your business, how can you use your skills, resources, products, services in a way that you haven't used them before, but that's going to address the problems that the world has right now that need to be addressed? When my book came out on April 14th, my book tour was canceled. And because of the pandemic, of course, there's no travel. And I spent 2 days not thinking like a rocket scientist and just being very miserable, basically, about what was happening, right? I was wishing for reality to be different than it was and trying to control what cannot be controlled, which is a really futile exercise, right? It's like tugging at a plant to make it grow faster. Not possible. Instead, the far more useful exercise is to become curious about tomorrow and ask yourself, okay, setting aside what I cannot control, what I can't change, what can I control? What is still within my power to do? And in my case, it was like, okay, I can't go on a physical book tour, but are there other creative ways of getting the word out about the book? And the answer is, of course there are. So I teamed up with a bunch of different authors who were in the same position as me. We did virtual events. I doubled down on podcast appearances. And I think in the end, honestly, my outreach efforts ended up being more successful than they would have been if I was relying on an in-person book tour. And I think the same idea applies regardless of industry, is if you've been forced out of the status quo, instead of wanting reality to be different than it is, I think it really helps to shift to this other mindset of curiosity, of becoming creative and using what's in front of you to solve problems that you didn't expect to be solved.
Yeah, I think that focus of what's within my control and what's not, and focusing on that. You said easier said than done, but sometimes just having regular moments of pause throughout the day to ask yourself that question. I know that's certainly helped me, because there are times where I am very upset about the fact that there are no live events, and so keynote speaking is off the table for the time being. But then I think back to, well, let's think about this. what actually can I do? It has opened up time. I'm not on airplanes. I'm not in hotels. I'm not traveling. It has opened up time for me to better serve my existing clients, to better serve upcoming new clients in different and unique ways that will make me better and stronger long term. So now this thing that didn't exist, this better service from a virtual way or using Zoom or whatever it may be, that is going to remain past this. And the thing that I already really enjoyed and liked will eventually come back. And I think that that's a way you can look at it and say, I'm going to be better for this. I'm going to be stronger coming out of this, even though I don't love every aspect of it. And I miss parts, a lot of parts of what this has taken away, but long-term we'll be better off from it.
Absolutely. And related to what you just said, Ryan, is the aspect of diversification too, right? So if you're we're told to diversify investments, but I think the same idea applies to your identity as well and the services you're offering people. So Ryan, if the only thing you're doing is in-person, physical keynote speeches, you're out of a job, right? All of your income is completely gone. But if you've diversified your identity, right? If you're not just a keynote speaker, but you also do consulting, you also do a podcast, you've got a blog, and you do X, Y, and Z, it becomes much easier to deal with uncertainty. Because if uncertainty affects one of those identities, you can lean on the other ones.
Yep.
And then the same idea applies to services that businesses provide.
Okay, two quick things before we wrap up here, Ozan. One of them comes from Shane because he texted me as we're talking, which is funny. But the first one is about how we treat each other and something that rocket science can teach us. You said rocket science teaches us about our limited role in the cosmos and reminds us to be gentler and kinder to one another. Can you share why rocket science will teach us or make us think about our limited role and might help us to be a little bit more gentler and kinder to people?
All of our differences disappear when you zoom out.
Yep.
When you look at the Earth from outer space, in Carl Sagan's memorable words, we're just a pale blue dot. And it also becomes clear how fragile the Earth is, and how little our differences matter in the grand scheme of things. Regardless of where you are, we're looking up at the same moon. The stars are all there, and we're being connected not just across countries, but across generations as well. And we tend to look down at whatever it is we're working on, whatever it is we're believing in. But if we can take the time to look up and realize that in the grand scheme of things, our differences matter very little, and that we can be gentler and kinder to one another, because at least for now, this is the only home that we have. And it requires us to be kinder to the planet as well, of course. But that I think is a really powerful image. I remember in the Apollo 8 mission, I think this was Jim Lovell, the commander of the mission, when they were circling the moon. So Apollo 8 was actually a really dangerous mission. It was the first time we sent the spacecraft to the moon, circle, and come back. But this was the first time that you could look at the Earth from outer space, and Jim Lovell could cover the entire planet with his thumb. And this was, during a very divisive period in American history, with the Vietnam War going on in the 1960s. And as he was reflecting on it, he was essentially echoing the message that you quoted, which is, look, yeah, there are all of these divisions and differences on Earth, but all of them disappear when you look at this just beautiful blue dot from the perspective of outer space.
Man, that's good. I should end it on that, but I have to end it on a funny one. I said, Shane, send me something about Ozan that I cannot find on the internet, because he knows my prep process is to scour and watch and read everything there is about my guest, which I have for you, every video on YouTube and certainly everything written about you as well as your book. And he said, ask him, why does he still watch DVDs instead of Netflix?
So
I did not find online. I did not find that online.
yeah. So I still get DVDs in the mail.
Really?
Yes, I still do. I might be the only
Does
person in
Netflix
America
still
who
do
does it.
that?
Yeah, Netflix still does that.
They do.
They still send DVDs in the mail. And
Okay.
here's why I do it. There's something about delaying gratification that brings people happiness. So if I'm just, if my wife and I are just sitting on the couch and like we can pick whatever movie, we sometimes do that, by the way. But I find such strange pleasure in like finding a movie, adding it to my Netflix queue, and then waiting for like 2 days for the movie to arrive, and then like seeing that like red envelope sitting in our mailbox. Honestly, it's sometimes more joyous than the movie itself. That anticipation of like the very like purposeful way of like, I'm gonna watch this movie, I'm gonna put it on my queue, it's gonna arrive in my mailbox, I'm gonna open it like a Christmas present, and then put it in. I just get, I know it's strange, but I get so much satisfaction from it.
Wow. I did not know Netflix still offered that service.
They do. Yeah.
Wow. I love the thought of the there's a purpose behind it. There's
Yeah.
a purpose of the delayed gratification, which I think could speak to some success in other areas of your life if you're willing to delay gratification. That's the type of person who's disciplined enough to put in the work when nobody sees it. You talk about writing a book. I mean, I know what that's like, or any of the big monumental things that get accomplished. There's so much done that nobody will ever see, and sometimes you'll do a lot of that work that leads to nothing. Right. That there isn't even any of the gratification part, but you have to be willing to delay it. So even in the funny part about Shane's talking about why does he watch DVDs, I love that answer. Ozan, this is really enjoyable talk. I'm very appreciative of you investing your time with me today. Where would you send my listeners to learn more about you online?
So the best way to keep in touch with me is through my weekly email. I'm not active on social media, and you can sign up for that by heading over to weeklycontrarian.com. And it's just one email. It goes out to over 21,000 people, and it can be read in 3 minutes or less. And it shares one idea with you to help you reimagine the status quo in some fashion. And then my book, Think Like a Rocket Scientist, it's available wherever books are sold. I do have a special bonus, if it's okay with you, Ryan, for your audience. If you head over to rocketsciencebook.com/learning, you will get 2 bonuses for ordering the book. One is a 30-minute training on my productivity systems. And the other is I recorded these after the pandemic. I recorded these 10 or 12 videos, really short videos, 3-minute videos with practical insights from the book that you can implement right away. So
wow.
You can find out
say that
about
again?
all of that. The URL is rocketsciencebook.com/learning.
Awesome. Thank you so much for doing that, Ozan. And as I said, really appreciate you investing your time with me today. And I'd love to continue this dialogue as we both progress, man.
I love that as well, Ryan. It was such a pleasure talking to you. Thank you.
All right. Thanks.